Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
My name is Julia. I was an admission officer at Haverford College, an outside reader for Emory University, and I currently work at Milton Academy, an independent boarding and day school outside of Boston, Massachusetts.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy has a bachelor's degree from the University of Georgia and a master's degree from North Carolina State University. She works in private practice in Raleigh as a mental health therapist. And I'm so blessed to be able to work alongside both my beautiful daughters at School Match for You, a college counseling firm that I founded in 2010. This week in the news, Julie and I will be discussing a Rick Clark blog from his Georgia Tech admissions blog where he compares college admissions decisions to college football. And we think you're going to like it. Our question from listener, Lisa, will join me to take a question about how hard is it or how easy is it to get a full tuition scholarship or to get a full cost of attendance scholarship from a college. And our interview, which will also be our college spotlight, Dan and Mary LaChance. And they'll be talking about Rochester Institute of Technology, part 1 of 2. Friends, for those of you who are Julia fans, Julia's back. Hey, Julia.
Oh, hello. Hi, Mark.
Hi, and I'm really excited because Julia has agreed to give us a tip, and I think it's a tip you want to listen to very closely. She's going to talk about when it makes sense and when it doesn't make sense to an appeal an admissions decision. And also, if you are appealing, some advice about how to do it. So take it away, Julia.
This is such an interesting topic. I love this one. And I'm curious your thoughts too, Mark. But generally, my rule of thumb for appealing an admissions decision is only to appeal when there is a formal appeals process offered by the college. That doesn't mean to say that I haven't had students try at other schools, and sometimes that's been okay. They haven't, been granted an appeal, but they didn't make anyone mad. But I've also seen people get pretty mad about the requests. So by and large, a lot of the midsize or especially larger schools do have an official appeals process. Sometimes it can be about, I didn't get into the major or school of choice within the university, or I would like to be considered for this scholarship and I feel like I met the eligibility, or just in general, I was denied. And I've had some successful appeals. I've had a few students come back from the dead at University of Connecticut.
I love that. Come back from the dead. What a great term.
I went through an appeals process at University of Arizona last year. And in fact, like some of those appeals processes, sometimes I did feel like the student really felt like they gained a little more control, even if we didn't get the decision we wanted. For example, University of Arizona, when they're just looking at sort of numbers, we were able to supply teacher recommendations and my counselor recommendation. We didn't get the outcome we wanted, but it felt like we were fighting as hard as we could. So, but to me, at least for my student base, since a lot of my students are applying to what we would consider selective colleges, it's pretty rare that there's a college in there that does allow for a formal appeals process. And I would say, by and large, if the college admits less than 25%, maybe even less than 50% of that, there's no mistakes there. They usually do have holistic processes where there's checks and balances. Whereas, for example, University of Connecticut, in this case, I had a student who did have a lower GPA for them, but they went to Milton and they had a lot of honors classes and they had a lot of advanced classes. And even though they had mostly Bs, they were still sort of in the top of our class. So just being able to kind of present that information did yield an admit. actually, unfortunately, a couple months later, and the student had already committed to another school. But I have had students, sometimes parents, especially, your first instinct when you get bad news is something went wrong. It's a natural feeling to be like, oh, like, how did this not happen? I think my child hung the moon, and so something went wrong. That is probably the most common thing I actually hear from parents when they get a deny that they're very unprepared for. So always take a beat, even if there is an appeals process formal. You want to get all your ducks in a row. If a school does have a formal appeals process, there's often very detailed directions on how to do this. And sort of like filing your taxes, you do want to pay attention to the instructions, because sometimes if you don't meet those requirements, or you don't do everything in order like the college has asked you to, you could actually risk your appeal going through. So take a beat, sit down, figure out what you need to do. If you do have a college counselor or a guidance counselor that can help you through it, always involve them. But I generally discourage any appeals unless the college has a formal appeals process that is advertised on their admissions website.
Well, I think that was well said. I think you hit a lot of really important points. Do they have an appeals process? Extremely important. Another thing is there is definitely a correlation between the selectivity of the school and if they're holistic, in whether or not you're likely to have any positive results. Like I have not had success with these low admit schools, that do holistic admissions.
Right.
The other thing that I would say is, what is the reason for the appeal? That's like really, really important, right?
Right.
Like if it was a mistake on a transcript or something like that, if it really truly wasn't the student's fault at all, those are the times when I find you're most likely to have a hearing.
Yep.
Versus something, and other things can be, it's not really a fault, but you're not necessarily going to get good results because, you had mono and now it's coming up and you're trying to explain.
Yeah.
Like those kinds of things. That's not what I call not your fault.
Correct.
Not your fault is like an error that was outside of your control.
Correct.
Kind of thing. And so I generally, like you, I really discourage it because I don't see a lot of success in it, especially with those highly selective, smaller school or holistic admission schools. Like you're right, the state schools sometimes can be different, and definitely schools that admit by the numbers, like you said. That's if you can make a case that this was an error of a grade and it was changed or something like that. I mean, sometimes those type of things can be, favorable. But, it's interesting. Like USC at one time used to advertise that 10% of people that appeal are successful, and they were welcomed appeals. But they feel like they've toned that down recently.
Yes.
I've seen some stats that show 10% are not winning appeals. It's not even close to that. And do you have any experience with that? Any thoughts on that one, Julia?
Absolutely. And USC has changed dramatically in my 8 years of college counseling. We actually at Milton, we group schools instead of like reaches, likelies, targets. We group them into their regular decision admit rate. And when I first started, USC was in group 3. Group 5 is our most selective. Those are your Ivy League, sub 10%. And USC moved into the sub 10% admit rate this year. And so I've just seen, when I first started, I used to get a couple kids with maybe a couple C's on there, get a spring admit. Now we might have 50 applicants and get one student into USC. So I can understand. And they have such a robust transfer process as well.
They take a lot of transfers.
Yes, the Trojan promise is there. So I've seen that even when a student does want to appeal, the first thing that USC will tell them is, please go look at our website about transferring. So I definitely agree with you, Mark. I think they've really discouraged it, especially the more selective they've become.
I was having a conversation with Dave maybe 2 years ago, maybe 3, about how selective USC has become. And he was like, are you kidding me? Because when he went through, it was, University of Second Chance and Second Choice, all these different terms that people had for it. That was, it's like, Dave, okay, get out of the dinosaur age. But our listeners might like this. Jill and I were talking off air before we came on, like I do with a lot of the co-hosts. We have our lengthy pre-chat where we talk about admissions forever. And we were saying, we should have a conversation on the podcast. I think our listeners would really enjoy it, on schools that have become a lot more selective, like in the last 3 to 5 years. Because there are a lot of people out there that don't work with somebody, either a school-based counselor or independent college coaching. You're doing this on your own, and we want to make sure we're helping you. And if you're using old data for certain schools, you are in for a rude awakening. And so we said, well, let's get through this admission cycle and see what observations we have from this cycle that can inform our opinion. But right now, Jill and I could do it. We could rattle off a whole bunch of names that, and it's challenging as a counselor because you've been doing it for a while and you think you understand a school, and then you have to completely recalibrate.
Yep.
And I certainly know I've had to do that with a lot of schools since the, really the last 3 or 4 years when the 30% surge happened at a lot of schools. And so, not trying to be negative, but the negativity happens if somebody thinks that, oh, this school's probably like a probable for me, right, or even a, what I sometimes call like a coin toss school, like 50-50, and then you get slammed with a denial and you're like, what happened there?
Right.
So we'll let this admission cycle wind down. We'll make our observations. I really feel we need to go through both the, not just the ED round, which is, of course, that's out now, but the regular round. We really need to see it in the regular round because that's where the bloodbath occurs.
Yes.
And once again, I don't want to make it all about the most selectives, because there's other schools that have gone from taking 80% and now they're taking 55% or whatever, and like we want to include some of those schools too. This doesn't have to just be a conversation exclusively about those single digit admit schools, and I think that we'd be doing a disservice if we only focus there. So we'll try to look at anybody that's moved significantly in the selectivity, and Jill and I'll take notes over the next few months and see what observations we have, and then come back to you on that. So we're going on record, so now we have to back it up.
Yep. We made a
awesome.
promise.
All right. Thanks for that, Julia. So for our admission vernacular, now we're going into the world of tennis recruiting here. So I'm actually going to throw out two terms all at once just because it makes sense in the context. So in the past, when it came to tennis recruiting, people don't realize this, but tennis recruiting in a lot of ways is more similar to others real number-driven recruiting sports, right? Or you can just look at how fast somebody is in the time sports and have a sense whether someone's competitive. So, for example, if I'm working with an athlete and they're a swimmer, it's really clear what's your 100 free, like what's your breaststroke, backstroke, what's your time. You got to have certain ranges for certain schools. And if you don't have that, then you're not in the ballpark. It makes it really easy, actually, working with athletes that are swimmers. It also really easy with track athletes. How far are you jumping? How fast are you running? What's your 100, 200, 400, 800 high jump time, whatever, right? And golf, same thing. Like what's your handicap? How and then there's ratings and rankings for golf too. And tennis has been a sport like that as well. Very, very different than if you're working with someone and they do field hockey or they do lacrosse or they do basketball or they do football or they do volleyball or they do baseball, right? Like that's a team sport where like film comes into play and there's a lot of subjective factors. Things like showcases and ID camps are much bigger factors when it comes to untimed sports. So tennis has had something known as the UTR, and that has been the standard that people have used forever, universal tennis rating. And what's your UTR? And if I'm working with a tennis player, certain schools, they're very, very explicit. We recruit players, that have whatever, 8 5s to 10 5s, or we're looking for 10s or whatever, depending on how strong the program is. Well, UTR, universal tennis rating, is now being replaced by WTN, which is the world tennis number. And I think I taught you something, Julia. I saw a little
Yes.
over there.
I'm listening.
Yeah, it's being replaced. And just there's so many people that have been frustrated with UTR. They feel like actually someone I'm working with now was talking about how a student had some of their best matches and their UTR dropped because it looks at your last 30 matches.
Ah.
And where WTN goes back. And it's just a lot of reasons why it's seen as more accurate. So you got 2 there. UTR. The UTR is still going to be used because it's been around forever. It's not like it's becoming obsolete. It's just that there's a migration now toward WTN and it's a pretty clear emphasis too. So went into the world of recruiting. I know it's niche, but thought it might be interesting to somebody who wants to know a little bit about the whole world of tennis. All right. And our big number, 1520. So we've talked a lot about how in this new test optional climate, schools have completely recalibrated their average test scores. And I thought I'd just give an example. Boston College, pre-pandemic, pre-test optional movement, 1395 average. New averages this year coming out, 1520. Big difference, 135. Like that's massive difference, 1395 to 1520. Now, here's the thing. That does not mean you have to have a 1520 to get in. Like that's how some people will hear that, right? Is that's a cutoff.
Right.
It's not a cutoff. I don't know about you, Julia, but one thing that I find really tricky in the test optional movement with giving people advice, and you and I asked Lee Coffin this when we interviewed him. Are you looking for someone to be at your median, or are you looking for them to be in your 25th to 75th percentile? Schools differ on that.
Yes.
If they're really, really playing the test score game and they're trying to use their high test scores as part of their brand building and marketing, then they'll lean more toward, the middle numbers. If they're like, look, if you're anywhere in this range, the test score, it's kind of a non-factor for us. Non-factor is too strong of a word, but it's, we're comfortable with it. It's a better way of putting it. Then they move more there. And of course, the main thing is what are your institutional priorities? What hooks do you have, right? Like that's all, every test score is all going to be filtered through the context. And it's not just hooks. It's like, what is the context? Julia, how much, I know this, the answer to this, but I'll ask it anyway. When you guys would talk test scores at Haverford, and this, of course, mind you, I'm asking you about this in a world where test scores were required.
Right.
How much training did reps get about you have to look at context? If this is a family and Spanish is spoken in the home all the time, we can't expect them to crush the evidence-based reading or writing number. Can you? Or it's first gen and mom's a waitress and dad's a bus driver. Or can you talk about that?
Yeah. I mean, I was also so lucky because we were such a small office that was so focused on the Quaker process of committee that really there was lengthy discussion on context for every student. But we didn't get any formal training. And in fact, one of my biggest memories is literally just having a massive argument with my first reader on Southern California for every applicant and this was also when I worked at Haverford, we still required SAT subject tests as well. Yeah. And basically I would have in Southern California, especially I was the director of recruitment for diversity and multicultural recruitment. I'd have mostly first generation English language learners, parents who maybe didn't even graduate from middle school as a lot of my students. And so I remember my first reader that year, is their first year in admissions reading applications, kept saying, I don't know why this student can't get over a 700 on the physics SAT subject test. And I was like, oh my gosh, this 700 is like this. Where did this kid get this score? Like they must be a child prodigy. Like nothing points to that. So basically what we would do is, and this is contextual because just a reminder to our listeners, the last time I sat in committee for Haverford was 2012. So I've read applications past that, but the last time I sat in committee and, my favorite man, Just Lord, always did me a solid, where we kind of looked at like a threshold score combined with the major of choice from the student to decide, would we be, sort of like, yes, we didn't expect any high scores from these folks, but would they at least have a high enough score that would indicate that we would have enough support to make sure that they were successful in the academics of their choice. So, maybe if a student was first generation, low income, went to a large public high school, and maybe wanted to major in psychology or social sciences, maybe as long as they got a 500 on the English and reading and writing, and maybe they got, above that. Or for our sciences, we're really rigorous at Haverford. And so we need like a 600, where when I worked at Haverford, someone even way back 10 plus years ago, if you had under like a 1450, that was pretty low for us. So, but we had plenty of students we admitted who had that contextual background that showed other indicators of success. And we were happy to not worry about sort of our data in our numbers and rankings, and could admit students that had at least a score that was not at all aligned with the average applicant, which tended to be a white, wealthy student whose parents both went to a four-year college. So we had a lot more freedom about that. And even reading in the test optional world, there's just a little less of it. It's definitely contextual there. So looking at that. And I'll also say, looking at the transcript, even if you are maybe a overrepresented student, maybe you have not straight A's. And so maybe you do want to report something that is the median SAT score, because that would actually boost your transcript and your academic read. Whereas if you've got a very strong transcript, then I'm more apt to say, only report if you're above that median, because you're either adding a mediocre or average data point, where you should always be adding an exceptional data point if you can when you've got a really exceptional transcript.
Jill, I'm so glad you brought that up, because I don't feel we've talked about that enough. And I don't know if everybody caught that last point that Jill was making. So let's say you have a student that has, let's say they have a 3.5 GPA, and unweighted, let's just say, we can't get into all the complexities of contextual admissions in this context. So we have to keep it simple. So let's say they have a 3.5, GPA, and let's say the median GPA for the school they're applying to is, let's just say 3.75. But let's say they have a 3.5, but let's say they have like a 35 ACT or 1540. That's what she's talking about. Like, that would, well, I don't know if that's the best example, because that would be a clear submit, probably with the 1540. But even if you lower the numbers down a little bit, maybe it's a 32 ACT. That a 32 ACT is better than a 3.5 in a lot of contexts.
Mm-hmm.
So that's like your stronger data point. And maybe the 32, maybe the school's average is like 33 or 33.5. You may submit that because if someone thinks, well, this 32 was actually better than the 35, maybe they're a late bloomer. Like, you might have a better chance because it is your stronger data point. And that's what she was referring. And I know this stuff is confusing. I feel like, I almost feel like it's so confusing that we're just making it worse.
No, it really just goes down to each individual student and which college and what are you applying for and what's your school context. It's so hard to make a one size fits all or even fits most answer to that question. But
that's why I really do feel for admission officers now that are getting the question all the time, should I submit or not submit? Like, I really don't like it when they give the answer, well, if you feel like it reflects your intelligence. I hate that answer.
Yes.
But I also understand why they don't want to throw a number out there, because it's so all of the factors you've mentioned.
Yeah.
And I really wonder how I would have navigated that space, because
totally.
I was always really transparent and kind of bold and sort of said some things. I wasn't really PC. But I also know people don't want a 10-minute answer, and you can't give a 10-minute answer when you're at a fair and someone comes to the table on you.
Right.
So that would have been a challenge. And I do feel for admission officers on that topic, trying to navigate that space. The other thing you said that was so fascinating, and it just brought me back, subject tests. Haverford was a huge subject test school, and they did not let those go lightly.
No.
I know, and they used to feel like science in particular, like some of those,
Yes.
they used to feel were very predictive. If you weren't getting in the 600, just used to say this, if you weren't getting in the 600s,
Yeah.
like we don't have a good track record of you being academically successful at Haverford.
Totally true. And our faculty would back that up when we were there. It was deflating. And at the same time, it helped me with the right data. It helped me know that as much as I love this student and they deserve to be admitted, that we don't have the right amount of supports for them to be successful, and it would be unethical of us to set them up for failure.
And a lot of people, like you said, Julie, they may not know Haverford. Little small Haverford College, 1,300 kids, 6 miles of Philly, but it is really rigorous.
It is
really, really rigorous. It is
I could never do one class there, I don't think.
Did you notice from being there that it was, like, compared to Vassar, like, significantly more rigorous? Was it obvious to you?
Definitely. Yes. Yeah. And I would say, and I do think they have very different strengths. But you should ask Just Lord sometimes where we would do, especially in the transfer process, when we might get a couple of Vassar students transferring. He would look at the curriculum and just kind of laugh in my face. He's like, physics through the media, Julia?
That's funny.
Funny. So it really is. And it's actually been helpful for me when I'm counseling my students, because honestly, a lot of the times the same small liberal arts schools end up on the same list. And especially if I have someone who's really interested in STEM, maybe take out the E, Haverford is a much better fit for that student than Vassar. Whereas if I have a student who's really interested in humanities and the arts, fine arts, visual arts, then in performing arts, Vassar is, I would say is a better sort of fit for that kind of student. So, but I definitely saw that. And even the students I worked with at Haverford, I was like, whoa, okay. Like this is, they're super impressive. Haverford has some of the greatest amounts of Fulbright scholars.
Mm-hmm.
And a few of my tour guides got the Rhodes Scholarship in the 4 short years I worked there.
Wow, so, more than one. That's impressive.
Yeah.
Well, and the medical school placement rate is ridiculous.
Oh, ridiculous. And that's the other thing I tell students. So, and they really do have great resources, the proximity to Philadelphia, but also for a while, their president was sort of really high up at Cornell Weill Medical. And so they had like nanotechnology and stem cell research, things that you typically see at a much larger, R1 research institution.
Yeah, but when we're talking about subject tests, I was having this conversation the other day with a student, Julia, and I mentioned the word subject test, and they said, "What's that?"
Yes, I know, which I'm glad.
And I just realized, wow, admissions has changed because it was only 2021 that they became obsolete.
Right, exactly. And I forget about them fully now.
Yeah, well, every once in a while, I'll read something on like a school's website or something, and they'll still be up there. I saw one the other day.
Mm-hmm,
They're talking about and then I first I said, why are they putting subject? But then I stopped myself, because you probably remember this. There's kids that would at Westtown. There was kids that would take subject tests in 9th grade.
Right. Exactly.
So if you're in the 9th grade, you would have still taken it in the 2021. You know what I mean? You still would have. So it actually kind of makes sense for schools to still have it up there. But subject tests used to be a really big part of selective admissions, because a lot of schools would require 3 or 2.
Yes.
And you had to do that in addition to your SATs.
Right. Where do people get the time and money? I took subject tests in high school in 2002, 2003.
Yes.
Like, where did I get the time and money to do that?
Well, I was always a really big advocate of them becoming obsolete, because my argument was, even back then, this was like pre-KIP, when I was just, still back at Westtown. Like, public school kids don't even know what they are. Right. They have the hardest time, even not all public school kids. I don't want to paint all public school kids with the same stroke of the brush, because we know there's some very, very well-resourced public school communities that almost function more like independent schools with a the resources and the mentality and the access and the, all of that.
Totally.
So there are a lot of under-resourced public schools, and even mid making up a term, like middle-resourced, schools, that they would have the hardest time even like taking an ACT or an SAT in time, certainly in time for like the early decision timelines kind of thing.
Right.
Or knowing about dates and stuff like that. And I actually had a conversation with Jess about this, by the way. Susan and I used to serve on a board with Jess, so we get to see him a couple times a year. And I remember talking to him right after, Jess was over the Haverford office, for those of you who don't know. I remember talking to him right after Haverford dropped them. And we had this conversation, like on one hand, you had the predictive value that was very beneficial in admissions. But one thing he said to me is, we've noticed more kids are completing applications since we dropped them.
Exactly.
And like, yeah, that was my argument. Like, when you make it so hard for a kid to complete an application, then you end up with, to me, it's one of those things that really was favoring well-resourced schools. Just like a lot of times unintentionally. It wasn't like, oh, this is how we're going to keep those people out. It wasn't that. It was just, middle-class people making middle-class decisions and being out of touch with. Is that fair, Julia? I mean, I know you were in there fighting for first-gen families and doing that, a lot of stuff like that at Haverford.
And even those families that I was talking about in the context, they went to, California Academy of Math and Science, CAMS, which is a special high school for students so they can take college courses at Cal State Dominguez Hills, right? So these are still students who might be under-resourced in most areas, but there was a test-taking culture at their school. So they had access to these things. So yes, I'm so glad those are gone. But you're right, Mark, like it was just the norm. Every college was asking for them, or every selective college was asking for them. So I'm just so shocked that seemed so normal back then.
That's a big improvement though in our admissions world. Like those things were a headache and a pain, and they really did add for the stress of kids. Like you think it's stressful now taking an ACT, SAT, they made the testing dominate your high school because, first of all, some of the more selective schools wanted 3.
Right.
And sometimes, depending on the school, they even wanted them in certain areas, math and science or whatever.
Specific. Yep.
Yeah. And then think about it. You got to take these tests. And like the SAT or the ACT, you're not always taking them once.
Right.
So now you're doing that 2 or 3 times in addition. So it was just, I feel like I'm reminiscing, but it's not that long ago. We're talking 2020, 2021.
And if you remember, really only sort of well-resourced and then thus high test-taking students were really the only ones taking the subject test. So therefore, like I remember tears in my office of students being like, I'm 17th percentile in the nation. I'm like, no, you're 17th percentile out of a very small fraction of students taking. So it also skewed the scores. So it's also a more difficult test to sort of percentage-wise score higher than the average student taking the test. So
especially in some of the subjects. So some of the subjects were so niche that when you actually looked at the data of the number of people taking the tests, especially toward the end when they started to go, like when we first started doing this podcast, Julia, the subject tests were around, and I started counting down how many schools were requiring them. I remember this. And there were 27. And when we first started, and I literally was doing this countdown, I was like, we're down to 18 as schools started dropping. And then when you would look at the data, there were some of those tests that less than 5,000 people in the whole country were taking.
Wow, right?
Wow. Yeah, it's like some of the niche language ones and things like that. So anyway, this whole thing's not about test scores.
And now it's time for Hot Topics in the News.
So we have an exciting article to discuss with you guys today. And I know last time Julia and I were up, we talked about a Rick Clark blog, and we thought, gee, we're not being very creative. We're going back to Rick Clark blog again. But it was just so good that we said,
always.
we're gonna do it anyway. So, and like last time I read it, I'm going to read it again for two reasons. One, it's short, and two, it's interesting, and three reasons. I said two, and I'm up to three, Julia. I just think you'll follow our discussion a little bit more if I read it. So, the name of the article is, and I have to say one more thing. I also didn't want to do this one like a year later because it would feel really dated, because this article is comparing college admissions to how the 4 teams were selected for the playoffs for college football and how committees make decisions.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm like, I don't want to be doing this like in 2026. And it's like, we're going back and people don't even remember it, right? All right. So it's called The Committees and Decisions of College Admissions and College Football. So it draws parallels. All right, let me read it. This weekend, Florida State beat Louisville in the ACC Championship and capped off an undefeated football season at 13-0. Translation for non-sports fans, they beat everyone they played. They practiced and prepared for each game, and despite some hardships, including losing both their first and second string quarterbacks to injury, they achieved at the highest level within the context of their schedule. In other words, they demonstrated not just competency, but excellence. And they did so in the face of real adversity and challenge. Ultimately, however, they were left out of the 4-team college football playoff, which will include 2 teams, Texas and Alabama, who each lost a game this year. If you want varying opinions on how this should have gone, feel free to go down the internet rabbit hole or delve into the vitriolic threads on social media. But if you want facts, here are a few. And then what the article does is it proceeds to go through 5 different facts about the committee that all have admissions parallels. And then it does a little brief thing called, what does this mean for you? And then I want to open it up and hear what Julia wants to talk about within these points. All right, so if you want facts, here are a few. 1, a committee of imperfect humans made this decision. This group gathered in a room, presumably with veggie and fruit trays, plenty of gluten, and hopefully at least one recycling bin. They looked at team and conference strength of schedule, home and away wins, timing of games played, and a variety of other factors. At the end of the day, they made their decision given the quantitative information they had, as well as the goals they were trying to accomplish. Number 2, stats don't guarantee slots. On that note, their goal in this holistic review was not to admit or provide slots to the undefeated, numerically perfect teams. Otherwise, Florida State would be in, and Alabama, Texas would not. Number 3, supply and demand is an issue. When this group assembled to watch games this weekend and debate quality and merit, they knew their primary challenge was too many good teams for the number 4 of slots. They knew no matter what decision they made, it would be contested, debated, ridiculed, challenged. I can't tell you how many folks in that room were wearing quarter zips or on cloud shoes, but I can tell you they were thinking, why wouldn't we have expanded to 12 teams this year versus next? So that's a little bit of a side. You have to follow football. This is the last year that college football is only inviting 4 teams to the playoffs. They're going to 12 next year. So he's making the point. Everybody in the committee was thinking to themselves, all these teams are amazing. Why can't we take more? Number 4, geography matters. Is Washington better than Florida State? Perhaps. We really don't know. Could UGA, so UGA had been undefeated all year, 29 straight wins in a row, last 2 national champions, and they lost in the title game to Alabama. So you have to kind of understand that to understand what he says here. Could UGA have beaten Alabama in a rematch? Maybe. But one problem the committee had was 2 SEC teams and 1 ACC champion with tons of talents and big cases to be made for their spot in the playoff. 3 teams from the South. Is that really a national playoff? Conversely, we can pull in 1 from the Southeast. We can pull in 1 from the Southwest, or what some would simply call the Republic of Texas. 1 from the Midwest and 1 from the Pacific Northwest. Now that does sound intriguing. That sounds national. Hopefully you guys, your mind is going to the parallels to college admissions here. Number 5, money matters. And let's be honest, these 4 teams have big fan bases and impact major TV markets. Michigan gets you Chicagoland and Midwest markets, plus an absolutely enormous global fan base. Throw in a little, a lot of coaching sign steal controversy. You have to kind of be an insider to get that. But and Michigan means eyes, engagement, and bucks. Alabama is clear perennial powerhouse with a big national following, and they check the box for key markets in the South. Washington brings you Seattle and portions of the country others don't extend to as naturally. And Texas, Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, and more. We are talking about big, big money. Yes, friends, that is 3 bigs. Big, big, big money. All right, then the last part, admissions translation. Okay, test time. Which of these principles apply to college admissions decisions? It's like he's sort of giving you a test like a teacher. Is it 1, that people make decisions? Is it 2, that numbers are only part of the equation? Is it 3, supply and demand is the primary driver? Is it 4, geography matters? Is it 5, money matters? Then he says, admissions committees are congregating all over the country, just like the NCAA playoff committee right now, with fewer screens and personal jets to debate these same issues. How many spots do we have available? Question. What is our mission? Question. What students will help us shape a class? Question. Will this class help us grow our brand and build national interest? Question. Does the bottom line work financially? Question. So yeah, the answer to the test is all of the above. So what does this mean for you? It means in college admissions experience, many things will be outside of your control. You will not be able to influence or control who is making these decisions. You will not know all of the machinations and factors that they took into consideration. You won't be able to control how strong the other applicants are that year, or from your state, or your region, or in your college major. It means that despite having great numbers, maximizing what was available to you, and showing tons of preparation, fortitude, character, and potential, you may not get in some highly selective colleges. 3, it means that it's not you, it's them. If you get deferred or denied or waitlisted this month of the year, it does not mean you are not talented or bound for amazing things in college and beyond. Over the years, I've continually quoted my friend Pam Ambler, who says, the way college admission decisions are made is not how they feel. Boom. Spot on. That's pretty deep. I want to read that again. The way college admission decisions are made is not how they feel. Boom. Spot on. A defer or deny does not mean you're not smart or amazing. It just means you'll go on to demonstrate all of that elsewhere. What can FSU do now? They can sit home and cry, sure. But ultimately, they will need to pick themselves up and go win their bowl game. Life lesson. Succeed when you get opportunity. I could keep drawing parallels all day. Well, I'll just stop there. Happy holidays, friends. All right, Julia. You see why this is a popular blog. That's great writing.
Absolutely.
So where do you want to go with this?
I just want to thank you first, Mark. When you first gave me this article, I had just read the first paragraph and I was like, Mark knows I don't know anything about football. Why are we doing this?
But you know admissions.
I was like, maybe this is wrong. Is this for someone else? And then kept reading. And then I absolutely used this analogy with a student this week. And it absolutely let them understand much more. I think sometimes students sort of intellectually know these factors, but don't emotionally know them. They don't really take them in. And for whatever reason, the student happens to like football. It resonated with them. It's also helpful that I'm just going to do a little shout out that number 20 on Michigan running back Kalel Mullings is a Milton grad. So it did help that I could use Michigan in that conversation. But this is a really, to me, kind of helpful way to really provide an analogy that feels fun and maybe resonates better with some students about trying to understand maybe, you could be the perfect student and not get the perfect outcomes. And this is a really good example of why.
Yeah, I know. I was thinking if I was teaching a college counseling class right now. And I used to do that when I was a kid. I had a counseling class once a week that I would teach. And Susan, for years, well before I got there, always had a college counseling class at Westtown. I would actually make this required reading, and we'd have a discussion about it because I think it's powerful. So let's talk about some of the points. Which one of the points he made are you interested in talking about a little bit more?
I think just starting with the premise about why is Florida not in, right? In
Mm-hmm.
terms of having a perfect record, and then looking at why they made the decision for those 4 teams, given the fact that they needed to meet all of those criteria, right? So that even with a perfect record, that colleges with less than a perfect record were selected rather than them.
Yeah, and a real close cousin to that is this point about stats don't dictate everything, right? So in an admissions context, it's and then a lot of people aren't going to like this, but I'm just going to say it. You don't have a right to be upset because somebody got into a school with lower stats than you.
Right.
Like, I know how that feels because I have students say it to me all the time. I had a student, say to me last year, 3 kids got into Georgetown from my school with lower stats than me.
Yeah.
I'm pissed, and you actually don't have a right to be if you really understand how admissions decisions work.
Mm-hmm.
And I say that particularly because I do find stats lead to entitlement.
Yes.
In a major way in college admissions. And it's somewhat understandable because if you're being told this test is so important, so important, so important, so important, and then you crush it, then you can't tell me it's important and I crush it and now there's no benefit. So I get intuitively how it works.
Mm-hmm.
It's not how it works at highly selective schools. Stats are more pass-fail.
Right.
So I like to explain it. It's a pass-fail test. Once you get into the range where they're comfortable with your scores, then all the other factors are going to come into play, right? So I think that stats point is really important, the application to college admissions. I think some of the other points he really made were important. Like, I really like, he started talking about money matters.
Yes.
Like, that's one of the secrets out here. I've been building a list. I did this a couple of years ago, Julian. I want to do it again because we get new listeners all the time and my thinking evolves as well. What are the things that if somebody was to be in admissions would surprise them? Maybe we can talk about that sometime. That might make for a good conversation. Yeah. You know what I mean? If we were to take our listeners and they were to have an admissions job, especially at a highly competitive school, what would be the things that would surprise them? And definitely when I do it, one of the things I'm going to say is how often money ends up being a factor at who gets in and who doesn't.
Right.
And that is not something that you really can expect admission offers to talk about in info sessions and things like that as much as it's true. Like, they may mention we're in need of where school, or they might say if it comes down to the wait list, money is oftentimes a factor because we're out of money. But they really usually don't go into the full depth of the complexity of how much it really plays a role.
Right.
Like, we intentionally recruit certain areas because we know that not only do they have a college going population, but a sizable number of those families are high pay or full pay.
Yes.
And that's something that's not even talked from my experience. I don't know, you can tell me from my experience, that's not something that's even talked about a lot, even to admission officers when they go out. But the powers that be, when they're making plans and all that, are very much mindful that we can't just go exclusively to under-resourced and middle-resource schools and expect that we can bring in enough money to fund our operating budget.
Right.
So I thought that was a really, really good point. I thought the point he made about how are you going to handle it, like the end, like, so what happens? Yes. So for those of you who don't follow football, you've probably heard of the term bowl games because there's like a zillion of bowl games, right? Just because you're not one of the 4 teams selected to be in the playoffs, it doesn't mean your football season's done. You're still going to get invited to another game. It's just, you're just at the kiddie table, not at the big stage. And so he made the point, okay, are you going to pout and suck your thumb? He didn't put it that way, but, that's basically what he said. Or you're going to, pull yourself up and go on and do your best. And, we're not talking about stuff that's easy. You know, you might be talking about an 18-year-old that's worked extremely hard for 3 or 4 years, and they might have had an incredible amount of success in their high school or even in life. And for sometimes not getting in feels like one of the bigger punches in the gut that they've had in their 18 years on the planet.
Oh, yes.
So I'm not, I don't mean to be callous and cavalier and make it sound and just be dispassionate and make it sound like this is not hard to do, because it can be hard to do, especially if you've fixated on a school, but it's still the right thing to do, and it's still going to be in your best interest, to move on. Anything else you want to share on anything, those points or others, Julia?
I think the geography point as well too is
Yes.
really important, and it's really tied into this money piece, right? And that I think we've talked about this before, but in some states, if you go, there's these maps that folks put out that indicate the highest paid person in each state. And if you go to places that are maybe in the middle of the country, for example, or sometimes in the South, it tends to be the football coach of these universities, right?
Yeah.
So, and these teams bring in tons of money for the university. And so they need to make sure that not only are they honoring those big ticket teams that make a lot of money and have lots of ESPN spots, but also making sure they're getting some of those other geo markets or geographical markets where there is a good spot of money or potential for money, like in the Washington example, right? So drawing in folks on the West Coast, for example, where we often hear, Texas and Michigan and certainly the South. So I just think that's really important, and not even just, to balance your financial aid budget or to make sure you're meeting enrollment numbers, but also colleges think about money in terms of donors as well. Like you might have a student whose family has the ability to donate, even if they have no connection to that school. That information is available to the development offices at colleges. And so they might admit a student, not because they're full pay, but their ability to donate significant money over time as well. So you need to keep those kind of pipelines and recruitment up to be able to kind of stay prosperous and, quote, build your national brand as well.
I know what some of you may be thinking. That is so unfair. That is so biased in favor of well-heeled families. Well, I'll share a story that occurred when I was in admissions. I was having this conversation with one of the other associate directors. We had 3 associate directors, and I was one, and this mom was another. And I saw her shaking her head. And it was that kind of head shaking that revealed dissatisfaction, maybe even disdain or disgust. So I was like, "What's wrong?" And she said, "I just feel like some people don't understand the business side of schools." So she was referring to a student that we had admitted. And one thing that definitely played a role was the fact that the parent of the student was an alumni and a big donor. And I remember this like it was yesterday, because she said, "How do you think our salaries are paid? How do you think we're able to give millions of dollars in financial aid to under-resourced students if it wasn't for these generous families who donate to us?" Yeah, and along that national brand, I kind of like the point that he brought up too. It wasn't explicitly one of his main subpoints, but he clearly elucidated it when he talked about if they would have gone, like a lot of people feel like Georgia and Alabama were 2 of the top 4 teams in the country. In fact, all the statistical metrics say that.
Right.
They do. But are you going to have Georgia, Alabama, and Texas, 2 Southeast and 1 Southwest team? And like football's a national sport.
Right.
And so the point that I'm saying he didn't explicitly say, but it comes into play sometimes, is part of what he was talking about. He was talking about national brand, but he's also talking about politics. And it would be naive to not say that politics ever factors in college admissions. There are people who, you need to admit because the blowback against you would be so bad if you didn't admit them.
Yes.
That you just need to do it.
Yep.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, people might be thinking, "What are you talking about?" Well, I'll just give an example of a kind of an obvious one. What if the president's kid was applying to your school and you went through the admissions committee and denied the president's kid? Like,
Somebody wouldn't have a job after that.
and what about a wealthy donor or kid of a wealthy donor whose name's all over those buildings everywhere?
Yep.
They're actively funding a lot of your campaigns, and that if we deny this kid, like, there'll be hell to pay. Like, politics can play a role too.
Yes, absolutely.
That wasn't one of his main points, but it was implied clearly when he said, "Do you really want 3 Southern teams? And you're a national school?" That also links to his point about geography. Now, geography can factor lots of ways, right? In the case of a place like Georgia Tech, it's way harder to get in out of state, and it's way harder to get in out of the country. They really have like 3 different admit rates. They have their international admit rate, which will probably be single digits this year. And then they have their out of state admit rate, which is under 15%. And then have their in Georgia admit rate, which is still really competitive because people in the state generally know not to apply unless they're really, really strong. but it's noticeably higher than the 49 other state, admit rate because they've got a commitment. They're going to take 60% from Georgia, 30% from the other 49 states, 10% international.
Right.
So geography does factor in. And the geography is tricky because it can work to your advantage too. Oh, gee, we don't have anybody from that area. We need more private schools, public schools. Oh, our commitment is to our state, right? So I think the parallels committee. And then here's another thing. Different people on that committee could have had very different views.
Right. Totally.
Because it's individuals who process and it's not formula driven.
Right.
And that's the same thing that happens in college admissions, like
Absolutely.
all the time, right? Like, like most schools have some system of voting for somebody when you agree, like when it comes time, whether it's Haverford was more consent. Were you guys literally consensus on everything?
Yes. So that would lead to 12-hour committee days a couple times. Yes. So one time we had a 12-hour actually conversation about one student. Yeah.
Really long, Julia.
Yes.
You should have saved that for my big number.
I know. And we admitted the student and they never came.
No, 12 hours. I think 2 hours is the most I've ever been a part of. And I thought that was long, but that's the extent to which you try to get it right sometimes.
Right.
And then sometimes these things are really complicated, for us, sometimes we had to have specialists come in and, we have to have the learning specialist come in and give feedback on this. And then you have to have the whatever, maybe they're musically talented and you're getting feedback. I mean, there's just a lot of different complexities, but you try hard to do it and get it right. But there's a subjective element, and most of the time, every school is set up a little differently, but the way most schools' processes are set up, when it's a clear-cut decision, accept or deny, the process moves quicker.
Yep.
But the ones that are difficult go to committee where you have all this discussion and multiple voices and all the complexity. It's all a little different. Sometimes the territory manager presents, sometimes it's a little different, but then you have a vote. And what happens invariably in complex decisions is it's usually not unanimous.
Right.
Showing the subjectivity piece, and how that plays. So here's a question, Julia. What should our listeners take away from this? Like, we talk about parallels of football and all this stuff. Like, what would you want some of their takeaways to be?
I really think that last quote that you said and said it twice makes all the sense. That basically, once you get your foot in the door, it begins to be a whole thing that's out of your control. It's not about feelings. It's not about what they maybe want to do. Maybe it's not about what's fair. It's definitely not about what's fair. Usually, it's not about what is just desserts. It's not about it's all these other factors that, if you are lucky enough to get your foot in the door, which is most applicants at most schools, that there's a lot at play. That that line that it isn't you, it's them is really true. And I know it's so hard, especially as a 18-year-old or older or younger, to really take that in. But I think the more you can take that in, the less you're going to sit there and cry about it, and be able to move on and maintain your self-worth and know that there's plenty of good football programs out there, just like there's plenty of great universities out there. It doesn't mean that because Florida was not invited, it doesn't mean that they're not one of the best programs out there, right? You could be one of the best students out there, even if you weren't admitted to, your first choice college.
Yeah. And my thought that comes to mind, and it's something I said once on the podcast, and then I had a conversation with a podcast listener, and he said, that thing you said really stuck with me. So for those who didn't listen to it, Christoph Gutentag is over the admission office at Duke. He's been there 30 years, and he's one of the giants in the profession. He tends to be more on the transparent side, which really can make for a good combination of knowledgeable person who's really transparent. And I can't remember now if it was the College Board or NACAC. I'm pretty sure it was NACAC. He's at NACAC. Well, these are two huge, big conferences, by the way, in college admissions. And somebody, to make a long story short, the conversation came up about how admissions isn't fair.
Mm-hmm.
And he basically said, and I don't want to, this is not a quote, but in essence, he said, well, you don't think it's fair because it's not about you. It's about us. It's about our needs.
Exactly.
So it doesn't feel fair to you because you're thinking of your needs, but we're thinking about our needs, and we have to admit with our needs in mind.
Right.
And that's, I think, the thing I want our listeners to understand. Schools admit according to their needs. And if you don't line up with what their needs are, that's when the frustration, if you don't understand that, take a step back. If you don't understand that, that's when the bewilderment, that's when the frustration, that's when all the angst and all of that settles in, because how could this have happened? And it tends to be really magnified because people are like, I don't understand how they took that kid. That tends to be right. How could they take that kid over me?
Right.
And of course, oftentimes this is coming from parent talk. This is a parent talk talking too, right? And the reason is because that kid was meeting that institution's needs. And I do want to say one thing about this, and I know this is really, really hard. Don't feel like you understand another person's file.
Yeah.
Like, I have all these conversations with people, and they feel like you would have thought they read the other student's file. They were part of the committee because they're so confident that it was wrong to take that kid.
Right.
And you haven't read the file. You don't know what was in the file, and you don't know what the needs of the institution were. Anything you want to say on that, Julia?
I completely, and it's even, in my world, we're all in one little environment here. So
yeah, for you.
My students come in and be like, or I've had parents list out every student that they think is less good than their own child, which is, by the way, unkind and also not a good mental exercise. All that doesn't get you any answers. It makes you feel worse.
It's like torturing yourself.
It is. And it doesn't make your student feel good either, parent, if you were doing that. But a lot of my students, and in some ways it's a lovely thing, they think that sometimes their peers are better than them, right? On their transcript. And it might be because they're in class with them or they see what they do. And I'm like, you don't know. And in fact, you actually might have something that I think is more valuable at most colleges than the student whose transcript you perceive to be perfect, which maybe it's not actually. So it is, as they say, comparison is the thief of joy. It gets you nowhere. It doesn't help you understand the decisions whatsoever. So the more you can make peace with what our main point is here, the less you're going to have to go through those mental gymnastics that just bruise you.
So, Julia, what do you say when a parent comes in and says, like, my kid is stronger than this kid and this kid and this kid and this kid, and they got in? Like, what do you say to that family?
Basically what I just said, I said, I don't think this is a fruitful exercise. You don't know what was in the file of the student, and you don't know what that particular school was looking for. And I cite that sometimes we can see students get different results at equally selective schools, right? Which just goes to show you that there's something that they're looking for. And sort of that, I'll give them, like I say, sometimes I give them about 48 hours to stew and get out some of their bad emotions. But after that, I'm no longer listening. You're no longer talking about it. It's not going to make you feel any better. And like I said, frankly, it's unkind and disparaging to other students. And if that was what I say to some parents is, if that was one of the other students' parents saying about your kid these things, how would that feel, right?
That's a really important point, Julia,
Yeah.
because the thing is, what happens is that does get out to that other kid.
It does.
Because Julia and I, we're part of those conversations, and that hurts and hurts deeply.
It does.
A lot of times it's in the context of their hook, right?
Oh,
and it could be anything. It could be they only got in because they're an athlete, or I had someone say the other day, last year, they said, Penn is going for more first-gen kids. And it was like a really disparaging, it was like more or less, like more, it may have been, may have been a euphemism for more less qualified.
Right. And now you're making a value judgment on marginalized groups, right? Which to me is all part of white supremacy and racism and classism and elitism. And it's a really dangerous, I know it's made in the heat of the moment. And I know you, understandably, you spent more time with your child than any of the other applicants in the pool, but it doesn't move anything forward. It's hurtful to the other parties. And sometimes it's really hurtful to your own child.
Well, I'll share something just about the hurtfulness, and I'm not going to name a name here because this is someone who has a certain public profile. But there's somebody right now in the world of admissions in a high-level leadership position, and they went to, well, you know what? I'm going to keep it even more vague. I was going to name the school, but they went to one of the most prestigious boarding schools in the country, and they ended up getting in Designer U, and several of their peers did not. And people who they thought were their friends, all of a sudden, were angry. They weren't talking to them, and it hurt them so deeply that they were out of that place so fast and never went back for 20 years. And 20 years afterward, there's still wounds by how classmates made the student feel with comments. I just wanted to keep it vague because this is someone has a high profile position. And so I don't want people to be able to know, we have like sophisticated listeners, like, was that so-and-so from the class of, I can't have this traced back to the person because obviously there's something that's shared in confidence, but I think I said it enough to get the point across without, anybody being able to figure out who I'm talking about. But my point I'm making is they told me this story 20 years after it happened. And those wounds were still fresh.
Yes.
Several years after that, I talked to them again, and they've kind of made a little piece about it. They literally said, I'm not going back to that school ever again. Like, that's how bitter they were.
Oh, that happens. Yeah. I have one of my colleagues who's been in my office for 27 years. She got an email about a student who had a situation like that, and they had never returned to Milton. And the student made a point of saying how successful they are now, almost as like a, look what happened to me. And that parent and my classmates thought I would amount to nothing. And look what happened to me. But 20 plus years later, they sent that email. They'd never kept in touch with my colleague, anything like that. It just middle of the night email.
And so I'm glad we talked about this because I want people to catch themselves for all the reasons we've said. It's not healthy for your own psychology. It's not kind, but it's really hurtful. And these hurts can last for decades.
Yes.
So just be mindful of that. Well, this was a great discussion, Julia, as always. I know we covered a lot of things, and I can't wait for your entry next month. Thanks again.
Thanks, Mark.
And now it's time for a question from one of our listeners.
All right, Lisa, I know we're not going to get too technical in the weeds like we did last time, and this one will probably be a shorter answer. But Jason from Minneapolis has a great question. I'll let you comment after you hear it, what your thoughts are.
Hi, Mark. Jason from Minneapolis here. Really enjoyed your podcast, but one question I had was regarding how common full tuition and full cost of attendance scholarships are. Can you talk about what percent of students get merit-based full tuition and full cost of attendance scholarships, and what the reasons typically are that they are awarded those merit-based scholarships? Can you also provide a breakdown excluding athletic scholarships? I'm basically asking if you can help set expectations around non-need and non-athletic based full tuition and full cost of attendance scholarships. What kind of student profiles have you seen awarded these types of scholarships, and at what types of schools? Thanks.
Take it away.
Well, I wish I could say that my answer was, oh, they happen all the time and they're readily available for your above average student. But the fact is that full tuition and full cost of attendance merit scholarships are usually rare and difficult to obtain. And, I know that there are some schools that do have them, like, for instance, Stamps Scholars. I think many
They
public
do.
institutions have those. But, in a school of like 20,000 kids, there might be 10 that get the Stamps Scholarship.
I don't want to stop you for a second. I worked with someone a while ago who got stamps at Wake Forest, and they're 5.
Mm-hmm.
They're 5.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, it's not that common. I think there are some schools that do still give scholarships for national merit finalists and semifinalists, and that you
Yeah,
may
but
be
those
able to
are usually not full tuition.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think like University of Southern California, I believe, has one that
They do have
and, yeah.
tuition.
And then Tulsa, University of Tulsa,
Theirs
I
is
think.
more generous. Yeah.
Yeah.
But once again, most kids are not national merit, right? So it's a
Yeah,
small
it's like
percentage.
a very small percentage. So, I think people are always like, well, you can just get a scholarship to go to college. And I'm just sort of, like, here we go again, having to explain that maybe you can't get a full ride so easily, unfortunately.
Yeah, this was a massive challenge when I worked at KIPP because there was just this perception out there. I remember I would do this financial workshop, and I remember the first time I did it, it was for parents. And I said, how many of you are expecting your kid to get a full tuition scholarship? And the majority of hands went up. I'm like, oh my goodness. Then I had to have some tough talk. I wasn't very popular after that session. I had to break some real news down. So here's the reality. Everything Lisa said is correct. It's extremely expensive to run a school. It really is. Like, as much as people think cost of college is so much, take a look at how much people are getting paid. Most people are not getting paid what you think they should get paid for their level of expertise. So just because it's so expensive for just salaries and benefits alone, just for staff and faculty and support staff administration, it's really expensive. And so schools would go bankrupt if they gave away too many of these. So they can't. So here's the good news. The good news is only 11% of people pay full sticker.
Mm-hmm.
So most of the time you won't pay full sticker. Now, you certainly will pay full sticker if you're a family that does not qualify for any financial need and you're applying to one of the 36 or so schools that only give need-based aid. Then yeah, you will pay full sticker. But most schools, those tend to be the biggest brands out there because most schools really can't afford to compete without doing some tuition discounting, which is just a euphemism for scholarships. So the good news is there's lots and lots and lots of $5, $10, $15, $20,000 scholarships out there. There's a lot of what we call auto merit scholarships, a lot of them, meaning that your application will be your merit scholarship application, and you won't even need to do separate scholarship applications. So there's a lot of that, but it just doesn't work for the financial model for schools to give away too many of these. Most schools have at least a few full tuition scholarships. It's rare to have a school that doesn't have a few full tuition scholarships, unless it's a school that exclusively does need-based aid. Like we said, that's probably 36. I haven't counted them, but most of those schools are your highly selective private schools in the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast. Those are most of the schools. Obviously, the entire Ivy League, you can't get merit money. That's part of how the Ivy League was formed in 1946 as a football conference that would not give money away. Basically what was happening was these schools were playing each other in sports anyway, and people were throwing money at athletes to try to recruit them, and it got completely out of control. And they said, let's literally form a league where people cannot get money unless they qualify for it. So that's the genesis of the Ivy League. Literally, like if Brown was to start coming in and saying, we're going to start throwing merit scholarships, it's literally, I think they'd get booted out of the Ivy League. Like that's definitional to the Ivy League. And so that Ivy League perspective toward money, this is my opinion on the genesis of it, I could be wrong, it's like spiraled out to the other schools in the Northeast as well that are highly selective. So you're not getting merit money at Georgetown, and you're not getting it at Tufts, and you're not getting it at Williams, and you're not getting it at Middlebury, and you're not getting it at but all of those schools in that area that are highly selective. But you look around the rest of the country, you can literally count the schools probably on two hands that have no merit scholarship potential at all.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you look at your really, really competitive schools in the Southeast, right? Your Rices, your Dukes, your Davidsons, your Wake Forests, your Vanderbilts, your Miamis, my private schools, those schools have merit scholarship money. It's hard as heck to get, and it's very few people getting it, and those schools are already hard to get in. Then there's a few schools like Northwestern, no merit. Chicago, limited merit. West Coast, Stanford, no merit. Pomona, no merit, right? There's a few that are out there with no merit, but not very many. Only the most competitive, the competitives when you get outside of the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast. And listen, I mean, the way schools function is like the bigger fish you are in the pool, if they have merit, the more you're going to be bringing to the table, then the better chance that you're going to get merit, or you're going to get a larger merit award. So, yeah, there's not a lot of full tuitions. And Lisa, do you want to let our listeners know, in case we have a new listener doesn't know the difference between full tuition and cost of attendance?
Sure. Well, full tuition just pays tuition, but then you would still be responsible for room and board. Or I guess if you would still have to pay for your kid's apartment and their grocery bill. Cost of attendance covers all the costs. So that would be room, board, books, and tuition.
Yeah, exactly. So if you think about it in terms of billable, non-billable, you pay directly to the bursar for big expenses there, right? Tuition, meals and housing, student fees. So those are the big four billable expenses. Then you have really four big non-billable expenses, meaning you're on your own to pay whoever you have to pay. Transportation, whether you're driving all the way across the country and you're staying in hotels, or you're flying, or you're just commuting and you don't have any, but you don't pay the school directly, but it's still an expense. And then you have books and supplies, could be anything from the art supplies or photography supplies for a class to all your books. And then, of course, personal miscellaneous is anything from the Hamilton concert you want to go to the pizza you want to get with your friends, right? So cost of attendance is literally every penny that you pay to go to college. Tuition is just tuition. It's one of the four billable expenses, but it is the biggest of the four in most cases, unless you're like in a place like Georgia, where if you have a 3.0, you pay zero for tuition at one of 26 schools.
Mm-hmm.
Then in Georgia here, the biggest expense is meals and housing, which is also room and board, meals and housing. Same thing. Room and board's just an old British term that's been carried over, but it's meals and housing. So yeah, so cost of attendance is literally everything, like hitting the lottery, and you'll hear talk about the Questbridge scholarship. Yeah, that's cost of attendance. But it's hard as heck to get. And average income's $38,000, so you have to qualify by that means. So yeah, so the bottom line is they are out there, but they're rare, and they're for applicants who are extraordinary, and extraordinary is in the context of the school you're applying to. Like somebody literally could get a cost of attendance scholarship. Well, I'll give an example. So I'm working with this student, and they're open to go in HBCUs. And so I said, you're eligible for a cost of attendance scholarship at Dillard in New Orleans, or Tennessee State in Nashville. But this is a student that did not get in some state flagship schools. So you could be like an incredible catch at a school that doesn't see as many super high-end kids. And for another school, you don't even get in the door.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think we talked this one out, Lisa.
I feel like we did a good job. Well, Jason, I think you might have to consider paying some for your kids' college, and I'm sorry about that. We all feel
Well,
your
you know
pain.
what? I sensed by Jason's question that Jason understood there are not that many out there,
Right,
but
right.
he's constantly encountering a lot of people that do. He may even be a college counselor. And if you're a college counselor, you encounter what I did a lot when I did that presentation, the myth. The myth of the full scholarship is very, very prevalent. I sensed from his question that he was like, please let the world know there are not that many out there, because I'm tired of banging my head. He's probably, now I'm reading all into Jason's background like I'm some diviner or something, but
Jason will have to let us know what he actually does and
Exactly.
what the motivation was, just so we can see if you're right or not.
Yeah. But thank you for the question, because it's a super prevalent myth. And if we were doing a big myth buster website, which we probably should do a podcast, I mean, we probably should do one of those. I know some other podcasts do myth busting. This would be one of the myths to bust out there. Yep. So thank you for that. Best of luck. You know the drill. If you want Elliot Felix's book or Dr. Lewis Newman's book, just text me at 404-664-4340, and Anitra will get them out in the mail through stamps.com. Of course, Dr. Elliot Felix's book, it deals with success while you're in college, and Dr. Lewis Newman's book also deals with success while you're in college, but it focuses on critical thinking and the importance of critical thinking. Now, before we go to the interview and the college spotlight, as the producer, I get a few benefits, and one is I get to sneak certain things in when I think of them later. So, friends, 2 weeks ago, when we had our question from a listener from California, Lisa and I were discussing how can you know which schools are overlaps with each other. And after the session went live, I was actually listening to it, and I had another thought that just popped in my head. It's a simple one. Many colleges actually have a section on their own website called peer institutions. So try using almighty Google and just look up College X peer institutions. And it's not there all the time, but it's there enough of the time that it's worth checking. And it'll oftentimes take you to a section of the website. Sometimes it even explains to you why they regard these schools as peer schools. And you'll see anywhere from like 5 to 20 schools usually listed.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, in part 1 of Dan and Mary talking about Rochester Institute of Technology, Dan shares what he feels are the best things about RIT, and Mary mentions what she feels are the best things about MIT. Then Dan and Mary share what they wish would be different at RIT. Listen and enjoy. Our regular listeners know that my favorite thing to do when I visit a college is to just start randomly talking to students. I'm at the point now where the tour, honestly, you can just give me a self-guided tour and let me talk to students, and I'll probably get more out of the experience. I still like info sessions because they drop some nuggets. But so I'm going to treat you, Dan, like you're one of the students, and I've just descended in Rochester, and I've grabbed you away from hanging out on the quad and the whatever in the park and said, hey, do you have a few minutes? I'm a college counselor and I'm trying to understand a little bit more about this school. And you're going to say yes, of course. And so I'm going to ask you 4 of my favorite questions I like to ask students when I randomly talk to them. And by the way, I didn't even tell Dan I was going to do this. So this is totally extemporaneous, just like I would do it normally. So I always like to start out positive because it sets the tone well. So in your opinion, Dan, what are the best things about RIT?
The hockey team is definitely a great thing going for it. It's the first time in like 10 years that they're ranked. So they're in the top 20 teams. I believe they're 19th right now. Hopefully they keep going up. So there's a big arena on campus that it gets pretty rowdy in there, but it's a lot of fun. That's one of the great things. I'm a cybersecurity major, so obviously I love the state-of-the-art cybersecurity building. The food is very good, and the internet is amazing. The internet is actually better than we have at home, and we have very fast internet here.
That is great. And I'm going to double up with this, Mary. Anything you would add to that as a parent that Dan did not mention?
That he didn't mention, because I would have said the cybersecurity building as well. First off, the cybersecurity is really big at RIT. It's a 250 person club. They have in the fall a cybersecurity competition, and there were 15 teams that competed in the cybersecurity competition. Dan's team came up first. Then they had another cybersecurity competition to qualify for something else. There were 4 teams that competed in that. Dan's team came in first. And then the executive board has 2 positions that first-year students can be on. And one of the pieces of advice I gave him when he went to college was, don't be afraid to try for a leadership position. Somebody's got to fill that position. There's no reason it can't be you. And so he applied for one of the leadership positions and he got it. So he's on the executive board for the cybersecurity club in his first year.
Yeah, and so that position is the junior tech lead. So every week during the first 2 hours are dedicated to teaching just like intro to Linux, intro to Windows, just basic cybersecurity topics. And so the first hour is a lecture. The second hour is like a demonstration. So gives students like the hands-on aspects of it. The tech lead, what they do is they create the demonstrations and like virtual machines and that type of thing to give people the opportunity to actually test their skills. And so I'm sort of like an apprentice currently, and next year I'll take over the position. And I also wanted to add that it is actually, they're very proud of this, the club. It is the largest academic club on campus at RIT, which is
I was about to say, like 250 is huge.
Yes.
Yeah. And the club meets every Friday from noon to 4. And you ask, well, how are classes not scheduled during then? And the answer is the professors know better than to schedule their classes during that time for cybersecurity majors. And then they also have other meetings throughout the week where you can learn about other topics as well. But when I say there's a cybersecurity club at RIT and how much of a benefit that is to the students that go there, it's like you're taking a whole nother class.
Yeah.
Would you say that someone looking at cybersecurity should look at the clubs?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The clubs, it's not just a learning opportunity. Mm-hmm. It's a teaching opportunity. It's you're able to get like tutoring. You're able to get other opportunities, get access to other opportunities like the conference that I mentioned, like the competitions that my mom mentioned, that type of stuff. You wouldn't really get that unless you had a large club like that. So it's a very important part of learning.
And we should mention the YouTube channel. So if someone wanted to see what is the RIT Cybersecurity Club like, first you can go to RITSEC. That's the term for the RIT Cybersecurity Club. They have a YouTube channel where they post the presentations that they give to the club on that channel. So you could get a good idea of what that would be like.
Are all 250 of those cybersecurity majors?
There's, if I had to guess, it's probably about 200 cybersecurity majors. And then the rest are computer engineering, computer science, and then there's a couple of like policy and law majors as well.
Let's take a break to learn about Mark's recommended resource for the week.
This is Linda with this week's recommended resource, the website volunteermatch.org. For students having difficulty finding service opportunities or deciding how they'd like to volunteer their time, VolunteerMatch can help. The site connects individuals with volunteer positions that align with their interests, skills, and availability. You can search for opportunities by location, including virtual options, skills, and areas of interest. You can also search by keyword and positions that are appropriate for teens. Examples of opportunities range from helping with blood drives, online tutoring, to advocacy for voting rights. By using Volunteer Match, students can gain real world experience and develop new skills. Registration isn't required, but additional features like email alerts and newsletters come with that registration. Encourage your student to explore the many ways of giving back by visiting volunteermatch.org.
Do you think you're winning all these competitions? Of course, we know it's the brilliant Dan LaChance and his intelligence, of course, winning all these. But in addition to that, do you think that some of that has to do with just the strength of the instruction at the school? Or do you
Yeah.
think it's also partly just it attracts like kids that are super into cybersecurity that just come in the first place, or a combination of both?
So the two competitions that I did, they were just RIT personnel. So I don't know how much I can talk about how RIT compares to other universities in that sense, but I think a lot of the reason that my teams did very well was in the first competition. Even though we were randomly matched, my team had worked well together. Like, we worked very well together off the bat, and we had a lot of preparation for the competition. And two of us actually already did Cyber Patriot, which is some of those skills transfer. So a lot of the skills that we had from Cyber Patriot and securing systems were applicable into the IRSEC competition. And then the second one, I did very well because I had a fourth year student on my team who just wanted to get back into competitions, and he was one of the most knowledgeable people that I've met that's a student. And he, most of the competition for me was just learning as much as I could from him. And that whole 4-hour competition, I learned a large amount of information on how to secure Windows systems, and that will surely be applicable in later cybersecurity competitions.
One thing I'll add too,
Sure.
that's not specific directly to cybersecurity only, because if you notice when Dan was talking about a lot of this, he's like, he did this and he did this and he did this. RIT also has specific clubs for women in computing.
Oh, that's
Oh,
great.
yes. So there's actually two clubs that are a large. There's a sub club under RITSEC called WESIS. So it's Women in Cybersecurity, and that's fully run by women. It's not just for women, so non-women identifying people can show up to the club, and it's just another place to learn. And there's also executive board positions there that people can hold to get some leadership experience. And then the other one is WIC, so that one's Women in Computing, and they are a large tutoring center for computer science and cybersecurity students. And I know I can speak for a lot of people. We're very thankful that they're there, and it definitely helps having a support group like that.
I'm sure the employers are happy they're there too, because many of you may know this, some may not know, but it's a male-dominated profession.
Mm-hmm.
And so you come out of a place like RIT with cybersecurity, if you've got the people skills and all the other character, personal qualities, sky's the limit. Yeah. Yes. How common is it for you to find someone that the cybersecurity program is like the primary thing that drew them to RIT? Like, do you bump into that a lot in your circles, or not? Or is it more rare? They more stumble on it when they get there?
I find that a lot. There's a lot of people that I know that would not even apply to RIT if this club wasn't there and if the major wasn't there. So because the program is so strong at RIT, it draws in a lot of people to apply. I know people from California, Florida, like New Jersey, Maryland, that came up just for the cybersecurity program.
But the fact that RIT has a strong co-op program, and I will say the people are just nice. I grew up outside of
always good.
Buffalo, so I'm a little, I think, biased on there. But we often said in Buffalo that we were the most eastern Midwest city. So, and it was something that Dan commented on when we went to Accepted Students Day. He's like, everybody is just so nice here.
That's important.
I was
That's
blown
important.
away by how friendly everybody was, and everybody is just so willing to help. And you're able, it's a give and take too. So for example, I needed help on my computer science project. I needed some guidance, and one of the students that took it last year, he was able to help me out. And then just last week, I was in the club room, and he was studying for a math test, and I'm taking the same math class. So I gave him some of my study materials, and we helped each other study a little bit.
All right, I'm starting to think you're getting slipped some money on the side. You're getting like commission here from the admission office. So we're going to ask a tougher one next. If you could change anything, what would you change?
I would like to see the sun more.
That is very true. Like something you have to consider.
You definitely have to consider that when you go to Rochester.
If you have seasonal affect.
Yes. Yes. It gets very cloudy. It's a lot of rain. So it rains like 3 times a week, typically 2 or 3 times a week. There's a fair bit of snow, and it's cold. But I think that you can adapt pretty well to it, as long as you bring a nice winter coat.
So I have to tell a story. So in the mid-90s, I worked for Paychex, which is a Fortune 500 company started and headquartered in Rochester. So we'd go there for corporate training. And I remember one time I was with an older guy, and we went to a mall. And when we came out, we could not find our car. Hour and a half, freezing. I already don't do cold well. And you're looking, and then I'm competitive though, so I'm trying to find the car. So finally, have to flag down a security truck, and he like drives us aisle by aisle. So yeah, I know that. I mean, you know, that area can get dark and can get cold, and yeah, thanks for sharing that. I just have one RIT question. That some criticism I hear sometimes from my students is that they don't necessarily say the campus is that pretty. Do you feel that's fair? Is that a fair criticism?
I personally do think that is a fair criticism. I went and visited my girlfriend at Worcester Polytechnic Institute up in Massachusetts, and that is a much prettier campus. So it was a little bit gloomy going back to RIT, but they do have 2 state-of-the-art buildings. One's called the Shed. So the Shed and the cybersecurity building, both of those are a lot of glass. You can take in at what little sunlight there is from those big glass buildings, and I think it's getting better.
Yes.
So the architecture is definitely getting better. It is known for being brick city, because what used to happen at RIT is they were required to put this certain type of brick in every single building. That has since gone away, and the 2 newest buildings do not have any brick in them, and that's just starting more. And I saw the plans for the 2050 plan, so the plan for the next 17 years, and it looks like they're gonna lay into much more of a better architecture than what is currently there.
Friends, this concludes the first part of Dan and Mary LaChance and their interview about Rochester Institute of Technology. We hope you'll join us next week for the final part. Friends, on Monday's episode, we have a very exciting episode that you're going to really enjoy. There's this big rumor going around out there, especially prevalent with a lot of the test prep companies, that colleges are using something called imputed test scores. In other words, whether you want your scores to count or not, they're finding surreptitious ways to find your scores and include them into their reading process. And Julia and I will be taking that question from a listener on and also discussing some conversations Julia had with college admission directors about whether or not they're using imputed test scores. And we have a brand new interview, one I'm very excited about. Andy Strickler, the Dean of Admission and Financial Aid at Connecticut College. And we'll be looking at the topic of how does a college read a file when they get like 50 or more applications from the same very competitive school. You know, Andy's the Dean of Admissions, but he also is the territory manager for the competitive New York City independent schools and highly selective boarding schools like St. Paul's in New Hampshire, Phillips Exeter in New Hampshire, and Choate Rosemary Hall. And friends, I close you with this. Remember, college is a match to be made. It is not a prize to be won. See you on Monday, friends. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 15. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Linda Depker, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joyce Ducker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stalianos Dimitriou. And if you want to have a coaching session with Lisa, Linda, or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Our favorite method is for you to record your own voice at speakpipe.com/YCBK. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcasts. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Monday and Thursday.